The Devonian period, which spanned from about 419 to 359 million years ago, is often called the Age of Fishes. During this time, life on Earth underwent significant changes, shaping the world as we know it today. The Devonian period sits between two other major periods: the Silurian, which came before it, and the Carboniferous, which followed. It was a time of great diversification, especially in the oceans, but also on land. In the seas, life flourished. The Devonian saw the rise of many types of fish. Fish species became more diverse, and some began to develop features that would later lead to the first vertebrates moving onto land. Early fish, such as placoderms, which had armored bodies, were dominant. Their sharp, bony plates protected them from predators and gave them an edge in the fight for survival. But these fish weren't the only ones to thrive. Ray, finned, and lobe. Finned fish also began to evolve, with some of the latter developing the early structures that would eventually help them move onto land. The first significant steps onto land were taken by vertebrates. Amphibians began to evolve from fish-like ancestors. These creatures were different from the fish that had lived in the seas before. They had legs and could move about on land, but they still needed to live close to water. Their ancestors had developed lungs that allowed them to breathe air, a crucial step in the transition from aquatic life to land-based life. Meanwhile, plants began to spread across the land. By the Devonian, the first forests had begun to form. These forests were different from the forests we see today. They were made of plants like ferns and horsetails, which could grow in the wet and humid environments that were common at the time. These plants provided shelter and food for animals, and their presence would have helped to change the atmosphere of Earth. As plants grew and died, they began to form soils, which over time would help to support more complex ecosystems. The climate of the Devonian was also important. Earth's climate was generally warm during this period, which allowed both plant and animal life to thrive. The atmosphere had higher levels of carbon dioxide than today, contributing to a green. However, near the end of the Devonian, temperatures began to drop, possibly due to changes in the Earth's carbon cycle. This cooling climate led to a series of extinction events that affected many species, particularly in the oceans. Throughout the Devonian, the Earth's continents were arranged differently than they are now. The land masses were moving toward the position they would eventually occupy. This was a time of continental collisions, which formed mountain ranges like the Appalachian Mountains in North America. These mountain-building events shaped the climate and environment in ways that influenced the evolution of life on Earth. One of the key features of the Devonian was its role in the development of the modern world's ecosystems. The plants and animals that evolved during this time were the building blocks for the ecosystems that would follow. The first forests not only changed the landscape, but also altered the oxygen and carbon dioxide levels in the atmosphere, making it more suitable for the later evolution of more complex life. The Devonian was also marked by the rise of early insects. These creatures were among the first to fully adapt to life on land. They didn't yet have wings, but their evolution laid the foundation for the eventual development of flying insects. This was a significant step, as insects would go on to become one of the most successful and diverse groups of animals on Earth. The seas, too, were changing. Along with the rise of different types of fish, marine ecosystems were becoming more complex. Coral reefs began to form during the Devonian, providing habitats for a variety of marine life. These reefs would become some of the most important ecosystems on Earth, supporting many species and influencing the structure of marine communities for millions of years. As the Devonian drew to a close, the Earth experienced major changes. A series of extinction events, including the late Devonian extinction, wiped out a significant portion of life. Many species of fish, as well as some plants and early amphibians, did not survive. This extinction event, along with the changes in climate and geography, set the stage for the next phase of life on Earth. The Carboniferous Period. The Devonian Period was a time of significant change and innovation. It saw the rise of early vertebrates, the first forests, and the beginnings of modern ecosystems. Life on Earth took major steps forward as creatures adapted to new environments and new forms of life emerged. During the Devonian Period, Earth's landmasses were part of a supercontinent called Laurentia. This supercontinent included what is now North America, parts of Europe, and Greenland. The land was not arranged in the same way we see it today. Continents were still moving and shifting, slowly drifting toward the positions they would hold millions of years later. Laurentia was the core of a larger landmass that would eventually break apart into several smaller continents. It formed a vast and unified piece of land with the seas and oceans surrounding it. While it was a time of relative calm in some parts, the movement of the continents led to dramatic changes in the environment over time. In this arrangement, much of the land that is now Europe and North America was connected in some way. These regions had similar climates and environments. For example, parts of what is now eastern Canada and northern Europe were once near each other, separated by only a shallow sea. The land was primarily flat, with shallow seas on all sides. This provided a great environment for early marine life to thrive. The climate during the Devonian was warm, which helped support the growth of the first forests on land. The plants that grew on Laurentia were different from those we see today. They were mostly simple, non-flowering plants such as ferns and horsetails. These plants helped change the atmosphere by taking in carbon dioxide and releasing oxygen. This change made the planet more habitable for other forms of life. As Laurentia moved, it began to collide with other landmasses. These collisions caused mountains to rise and seas to form. For example, the Appalachian Mountains in North America are a result of such collisions during the Devonian. This process created new environments for plants and animals to adapt to. Some areas were pushed higher, creating cooler, more challenging environments, while others were left in low, swampy areas where life flourished. Life on Laurentia during the Devonian was not just restricted to the seas. While the oceans teemed with life, plants began to spread across the land. These plants were an important part. The first forests began to emerge, changing the way the Earth's atmosphere functioned. As more plants grew, they took in carbon dioxide and added oxygen to the air, making it more suitable for the animals that would eventually evolve to live on land. The transition from sea to land wasn't easy for all life forms. The first animals to venture onto land were amphibians, which evolved from fish. These early amphibians still had to live near water, but were able to breathe air, which was a big step in their evolution. As more species began to move onto land, the environment in Laurentia became more complex. It wasn't just about surviving in water anymore. Animals had to adapt to the dry, harsh conditions on land as well. The seas around Laurentia were filled with life. The oceans were home to many types of fish, some of which began to evolve into the first vertebrates. Fish, such as placoderms, which had bony plates covering their bodies, dominated the waters. These fish, along with others, were key to the development of modern species. Some of these fish started to develop features like lungs, which allowed them to survive in shallow waters and breathe air. These changes were the beginning of a long process that would eventually lead to amphibians, and much later reptiles. As the Devonian progressed, the Earth's climate became more unstable. At first, it was warm and humid, creating a perfect environment for life. But by the end of the period, the climate started to cool. This cooling was likely caused by changes in the atmosphere and ocean currents, and it led to several extinction events. The seas began to change, and many species, particularly in the oceans, did not survive. The cooling climate affected Laurentia as well. Some areas that had once been warm and wet became cooler, while others remained stable, allowing some forms of life to continue. The movement of Laurentia also shaped the development of life. As the continent collided with others, mountain ranges formed. These mountain ranges affected local climates and created new environments for life to adapt to. The formation of mountains also created new habitats for plants and animals. In some cases, the mountains blocked the movement of animals, forcing them to adapt to new conditions. These changes had a lasting impact on the evolution of species, forcing them to either adapt or disappear. The shifting of Laurentia and the other continents was not a quick process. It took millions of years for these land masses to collide, drift, and separate. During this time, the Earth's environment changed in many ways. Some areas of Laurentia became more arid and less hospitable for plants and animals, while others remained rich in life. These changes caused a constant cycle of adaptation, as species had to adjust to the new conditions. The Devonian period was a time of significant change for Earth. The movement of Laurentia and the other land masses shaped the environment and created new opportunities for life to evolve. The first forests grew, fish began to evolve into land-dwelling vertebrates, and the seas were filled with diverse life forms. While the climate began to cool toward the end of the period, the changes that took place in Laurentia had already set the stage for the next phase of life on Earth. During this time, the land masses were still slowly moving, and it would take many millions of years before the continents reached their current positions. This movement continued to shape life on Earth, creating new opportunities for evolution and adaptation. The supercontinent Laurentia played a central role in this process, serving as a foundation for the development of both land-based and marine ecosystems. Though it was not a time of rapid change, the Devonian laid the groundwork for much of the life we know today. The movement of continents and the adaptation of species to new environments changed Earth's landscape and atmosphere. This period set the stage for the Carboniferous period, where life would continue to evolve in new and exciting ways. During the Devonian period, the geography of Earth looked very different from what we see today. Most of the land was still covered by shallow seas. These seas stretched over large parts of the continents, creating wide coastal regions where marine life flourished. There were no large polar ice caps, which meant the planet's climate was warmer than it is now. The continents were positioned closer to the equator, which provided a generally warm and humid environment for much of the period. The shallow seas that covered much of the land were essential to the development of early life. Fish, corals, and other marine creatures thrived in these warm seas, and the environment became increasingly diverse as species adapted to the changing conditions. The shallow seas also helped to create fertile ground for the growth of plants, which over time began to spread from the oceans to the land. As for the land itself, it was made up of relatively flat regions, with some mountains starting to rise due to the movement of the continents. The lack of large ice caps meant that Earth's climate was more stable. Without the polar ice caps to regulate temperature, the planet was free to maintain a warmer, more consistent climate. This allowed ecosystems to flourish, especially in the tropics, where the continents were positioned closer to the equator. The warm climate made the land more suitable for plant and animal life, and the shallow seas supported the growing diversity of life in the oceans. The positions of the continents had a huge impact on the environment. Since they were closer to the equator, much of the land enjoyed a tropical climate. This made it easier for plants and animals to thrive in this warm environment. Forests, though they were still in their early stages of development, began to spread across the land. These forests were made of simple plants like ferns and horsetails. The growing plants helped shape the environment, changing the atmosphere and making the air richer in oxygen, which later supported more complex life forms. At the same time, the shallow seas that surrounded the continents played a major role in shaping the landscape. These seas were rich in nutrients and provided a home for early marine life. They were ideal for the development of coral reefs, which began to form during this time. These reefs became essential for the ecosystems that depended on them, providing shelter and food for marine creatures. The seas, while still part of the larger ocean, were much more connected to the land, making them vital to the survival of many species. The movement of the continents also helped shape the planet's geography. Laurentia, the supercontinent at the heart of the Devonian period, began to move slowly. This movement caused the land masses to collide, creating mountains in certain regions. For instance, the Appalachian Mountains in North America were formed as a result of these collisions. These mountains began to change the climate of nearby areas. Some regions were lifted higher, making them cooler and drier, while others remained warm and humid, ideal for plant and animal life. Despite the warm climate, there were no large polar ice caps at the poles. This meant that Earth had no significant ice sheets or glaciers. The lack of ice at the poles played a role in keeping the climate warm and stable. Without ice sheets reflecting sunlight, more heat was absorbed by the planet, which helped maintain the tropical conditions across much of the continents. The polar regions were much warmer than they are today, which allowed for different kinds of life to exist even in areas that are now too cold for most species. As the continents moved closer to the equator, the land became more connected. The shallow seas helped to separate different land masses, but they also created opportunities for marine life to spread. For instance, early fish species found the shallow seas to be ideal for breeding and feeding. The warm waters were rich in nutrients, which meant there was plenty of food for young fish. Over time, this environment helped to support a variety of fish, including the early ancestors of amphibians, which eventually moved from the water to the land. The lack of large ice caps also meant that sea levels were higher during this period. The warm climate caused more water to evaporate and form clouds, which then returned as rain, filling the oceans and shallow seas. These high sea levels allowed marine life to spread across larger areas. As a result, there was a larger portion of Earth covered by seas than we see today. The land that was not covered by shallow seas was often swampy or tropical, with dense vegetation supporting various species of early life. The lack of large ice sheets and the warmer conditions had another effect on the planet's atmosphere. With no polar ice caps to store water, the atmosphere became more humid and richer in oxygen. The increased oxygen levels in the air played a role in the growth of plants, particularly ferns and horseales. These early plants helped to reshape the landscape by converting carbon dioxide into oxygen. As plants grew and died, they formed soils, which eventually allowed more complex plant life to take root. This process helped to stabilize the environment and allowed more animals to move onto land. As the Devonian progressed, the warm climate began to change. The cooling of the Earth at the end of the period marked a shift in the planet's geography. While some areas remained warm, the cooling climate led to a series of extinction events. Many species that had thrived in the shallow seas began to decline as sea levels dropped, and the climate became less stable. The shift in temperature also affected the distribution of plant and animal life on land, as species had to adapt to new conditions. The geography of the Devonian period shows how Earth's land masses and seas interacted to create an environment that allowed for the rapid development of life. The warm climate, the lack of ice caps, and the position of the continents all played a role in shaping the world's ecosystems. The shallow seas, in particular, were key to the success of marine life, while the early forests began to alter the atmosphere and create a more hospitable environment for land-based creatures. These changes laid the foundation for the next stages of evolution and the shaping of the planet's future. During the Devonian period, the seas were filled with an incredible variety of life. The oceans provided a rich and diverse environment, supporting numerous species of fish, early marine invertebrates, and the beginnings of coral reefs. These seas were shallow and warm, creating the perfect conditions for life to thrive. Fish were the dominant creatures in the oceans, but they weren't the only ones. Marine invertebrates and corals were also spreading and evolving during this time, playing an essential role in the development of ocean ecosystems. Fish were at the forefront of marine life during the Devonian. They were diverse and rapidly evolving, and many different types of fish emerged. The seas were home to species like placoderms, which were large, armored fish with bony plates covering their bodies. These fish were among the most dominant in the oceans during the Devonian. They were well protected, allowing them to thrive in environments where predators might have had a harder time. Alongside the placoderms, other types of fish, including ray-finned fish and lobe-finned fish, were also evolving. Ray-finned fish were one of the most successful groups of fish in the Devonian. These fish had fins supported by thin, flexible bones. Their ability to move efficiently through the water made them dominant in many different ocean environments. Lobe-finned fish, on the other hand, had fleshy, strong fins that gave them more control over their movements. These fish would eventually give rise to the first land-dwelling vertebrates, the amphibians, marking a significant step in the evolution of life on Earth. In addition to fish, the seas of the Devonian were also home to a wide range of marine invertebrates. These animals, which lack backbones, were an important part of ocean ecosystems. Mollusks, arthropods, and echinoderms were all present in the oceans. These creatures played a role in the food web by providing food for fish and other marine animals. For instance, early trilobites, a type of arthropod, scuttled along the seafloor, feeding on smaller organisms. These invertebrates were essential in maintaining the balance of marine life. Coral reefs also began to form during the Devonian, marking the start of a long history of reef building in Earth's oceans. These early coral reefs were much different from the complex ones we see today. Corals, which are small, colonial animals, began to build structures that provided shelter for various marine species. These reefs created habitats for a range of fish and invertebrates, helping to foster a rich and diverse marine ecosystem. The coral reefs that began to form during the Devonian were crucial in shaping the ocean environment, influencing the distribution of marine life for millions of years. As marine life flourished, the seas were teeming with a variety of creatures. Some fish, like the placoderms, grew to enormous sizes, dominating the oceans. These fish were the apex predators of their time. The seas were not only home to large fish, but also to smaller, more delicate species. Smaller fish, mollusks, and other invertebrates populated the waters, creating a balanced ecosystem in the oceans. In this thriving environment, the food chain was becoming more complex, with different species occupying different roles. The marine invertebrates of the Devonian period were essential to the health of the oceans. These creatures helped to recycle nutrients in the water and provided food for many different species. For example, trilobites, which were among the most common arthropods in the seas, fed on smaller organisms. They were an important part of the marine food web, and their presence supported the larger animals that relied on them as a food source. The abundance of invertebrates allowed fish and other animals to thrive. The coral reefs were particularly important for the development of marine ecosystems. These reefs provided homes for fish, mollusks, and other marine life. As the corals built up their structures, they created complex environments with many niches for different species to occupy. These reefs offered protection from predators and provided a space for feeding, breeding, and shelter. In many ways, coral reefs became the foundation of marine life during the Devonian, creating a rich and diverse ecosystem that helped sustain the oceanic food chain. The seas of the Devonian were also marked by their warm temperatures. The lack of large polar ice caps meant that the planet's climate was relatively warm and stable, which allowed life to flourish in the oceans. The shallow seas were particularly affected by this warm climate, as they were more exposed to the sun. The warm waters were ideal for marine organisms, providing the perfect conditions for growth and reproduction. This warmth allowed fish to grow and evolve more quickly, leading to the rapid diversification of marine species during this time. The warm seas also allowed for the expansion of marine life. As the oceans warmed, species began to move into new areas, filling in niches and adapting to different environments. Fish, corals, and other marine organisms spread across the shallow seas, taking advantage of the rich resources available. As marine life expanded, so did the complexity of the ocean ecosystem. Different species evolved to occupy specific roles, forming a balanced and thriving community throughout the Devonian. The seas were constantly changing. The rise of coral reefs, the growth of fish populations, and the development of marine invertebrates all contributed to the flourishing of life in the oceans. The seas were teeming with a diverse range of species, each playing a role in maintaining the balance of the ecosystem. These changes in the oceans mirrored the changes happening on land. As life in the seas thrived, early plants began to spread across the land, setting the stage for the eventual rise of land-dwelling animals. The oceans during the Devonian were a dynamic and vibrant place. The seas were rich in life, from the large, armored fish to the delicate coral reefs that began to form. The lack of polar ice caps and the warm climate allowed life to evolve and diversify, filling the oceans with a wide variety of species. Marine invertebrates played an important role in the ecosystem, helping to support the food web and keep the oceans healthy. Together, all these factors contributed to the flourishing of marine life, making the Devonian a time of rapid evolution and growth in the oceans. The Devonian period marked a major shift on Earth as plants began to colonize the land. Before this time, life had been confined to the oceans, but the development of true land plants during the Devonian set the stage for the evolution of terrestrial ecosystems. The first land plants included mosses, ferns, and the earliest trees. These plants began to grow in the moist, warm environments of the Devonian, gradually changing the landscape and atmosphere of the planet. At the start of the Devonian, the land was barren, with no plants or trees to cover the soil. However, as the period progressed, simple plants began to spread across the land. The first land plants were mosses and liverworts, which are small, non-vascular plants. These plants didn't have roots, stems, or leaves like modern plants, but they were still able to survive on land by absorbing water and nutrients directly through their surfaces. Mosses were among the first plants to grow in damp, low-lying areas, forming dense mats that helped hold the soil together. As the climate warmed during the Devonian, conditions became more favorable for plant life. Ferns, which were more complex than mosses, began to appear. Ferns had vascular tissues, which allowed them to transport water and nutrients more efficiently than mosses. This gave them an advantage as they could grow taller and spread farther across the land. Ferns started to dominate the landscape, growing in the moist, swampy areas where water was abundant. Their large, broad leaves could capture sunlight more efficiently, helping them to thrive in the warm climate. In addition to mosses and ferns, the first trees began to appear toward the middle of the Devonian. These early trees were not like the tall, woody trees we know today, but were smaller and simpler in structure. The first trees were likely members of the group known as lycophytes, which were among the earliest vascular plants. Lycophytes had simple, branching structures and grew to heights of only a few meters. However, they were important because they had vascular tissue, which allowed them to grow taller than mosses and ferns. This was a crucial step in the evolution of plants, as it allowed them to reach higher into the air and access more sunlight. The appearance of trees in the Devonian had a significant impact on the environment. As these early trees grew, they began to alter the landscape in important ways. For one, their roots help to stabilize the soil, preventing erosion. Their growth also created more habitats for other forms of life, as insects and other animals began to take advantage of the new vegetation. The trees contributed to the formation of forests, which gradually spread across the land. The first trees were not just important because of their size, but also because of their role in changing the atmosphere. As plants began to spread across the land, they began to take in carbon dioxide and release oxygen through photosynthesis. This process began to alter the composition of the atmosphere, increasing the amount of oxygen in the air. The rise in oxygen levels would eventually make it possible for larger, more complex animals to evolve. These early trees were also among the first plants to have bark. While the bark of these trees was not as thick or protective as that of modern trees, it was an important development. The bark helped protect the trees from water loss and physical damage. This allowed the trees to survive in drier conditions, and as the planet's climate became more variable, the ability to withstand droughts and harsh conditions became essential for plant life. The presence of trees and other plants during the Devonian period also affected the water cycle. Plants help to regulate the movement of water through the environment by absorbing it through their roots and releasing it through their leaves. As forests began to develop, they helped to increase the amount of water vapor in the air, leading to more rainfall in some areas. This helped to create a more stable climate, supporting the growth of even more plants. With the development of vascular plants, including mosses, ferns, and early trees, the land began to take on a more familiar look. These plants created new habitats for animals, which began to venture onto the land as well. The first land animals were likely small arthropods like insects, which lived in the moist environments near bodies of water. The spread of plants helped to support these early land animals, as they provided food and shelter. In addition to their role in the ecosystem, plants were also important for the development of soil. As plants began to grow on land, their roots helped to break down rocks and minerals, forming the first soils. The growth and decay of plant material contributed to the buildup of organic matter, which enriched the soil and made it more fertile. This process allowed for more complex plant communities to grow and thrive. The spread of plants across the land also influenced the carbon cycle. Early plants took in carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and converted it into oxygen through photosynthesis. As more plants grew, they began to draw down more carbon dioxide from the air, which may have contributed to cooling the planet. The rise of plants also affected the distribution of nutrients in the soil, as their roots helped to cycle essential elements like nitrogen and phosphorus. While the first land plants were relatively simple, they set the stage for more complex plant life. Over time, plants evolved to adapt to different environments, leading to the development of new plant groups, including gymnosperms and later angiosperms. These more advanced plants would eventually dominate the land, but the Devonian remains a key time in the history of plant evolution. By the end of the Devonian, land plants had already begun to change the world in profound ways. They altered the atmosphere, created new habitats, and set the stage for the rise of more complex life. Mosses, ferns, and early trees played an important role in shaping the planet, and their spread across the land marked the beginning of the transition to the lush, diverse landscapes that would follow. The Devonian period is often called the Age of Fishes because of the rapid rise and diversity of fish species during this time. The seas were teeming with fish, which adapted to different environments and grew into many different forms. Fish were not only the dominant life forms in the oceans, but their evolution also set the stage for the development of other vertebrates, including the first land-dwelling animals. The most basic fish group at the start of the Devonian was the jawless fish. These creatures were simple and primitive, with smooth, elongated bodies and a circular mouth that allowed them to suck in food. Jawless fish, such as the lampreys and hagfish, lacked the teeth and jaws that many modern fish have. Despite this, They were well suited to the environments they lived in. These fish survived by feeding on smaller creatures or by scavenging, and they remained a common sight in the oceans for millions of years. While jawless fish were abundant, the Devonian also saw the rise of new and more complex types of fish. One of the most important groups to emerge during this period were the cartilaginous fish, which include sharks and rays. These fish had skeletons made of cartilage rather than bone, which made them lighter and more flexible. This gave them a significant advantage in the water, allowing them to swim more efficiently and chase after prey. The cartilaginous fish developed sharp teeth and strong jaws, which helped them become some of the most successful predators in the oceans. Sharks, in particular, became dominant in the seas during the Devonian. They evolved into the powerful, fast-swimming hunters we are familiar with today. The first sharks were smaller and less specialized than the ones we see now, but they had a strong bite and keen senses that helped them locate food. Their ability to swim quickly and catch prey made them one of the top predators in the oceans. Alongside the cartilaginous fish, the Devonian also saw the rise of the first bony fish. These fish had a skeleton made of bone rather than cartilage, which made them more rigid and durable. The bony fish were highly successful and quickly became the most diverse group of fish in the oceans. Unlike the cartilaginous fish, which remained relatively unchanged for millions of years, the bony fish continued to evolve into many different forms, filling a variety of ecological niches. The bony fish were divided into two main groups, the ray-finned fish and the lobe-finned fish. Ray-finned fish are the most common type of fish today. They have fins supported by thin, flexible bones that allow them to move quickly and efficiently through the water. These fish include species such as salmon, trout, and goldfish. In the Devonian, ray-finned fish were beginning to evolve into the wide variety of species we recognize today. Lobe-finned fish, on the other hand, were less common, but they played a crucial role in the evolution of vertebrates. Unlike ray-finned fish, which had thin, fan-like fins, lobe-finned fish had thick, fleshy fins that were more like the limbs of land animals. These fish could move their fins in a way that allowed them to walk along the sea floor. This feature would eventually lead to the evolution of the first amphibians, as some lobe-finned fish began to venture onto land. The first amphibians are believed to have evolved from these fish, marking a key step in the history of life on Earth. The vast diversity of fish species during the Devonian led to a highly competitive environment. Fish filled a variety of roles in the ecosystem, from predators to scavengers to herbivores. Some fish, like the placoderms, were heavily armored with bony plates, which helped protect them from other predators. These fish were among the largest in the oceans, and their armor made them difficult to hunt. Other fish, like the jawless lampreys, were more reliant on feeding off of other fish, either by sucking their blood or scavenging on dead bodies. The waters during the Devonian were teeming with life, and fish played a central role in shaping the food web. Large predatory fish, like sharks, kept the populations of smaller fish in check. Meanwhile, smaller fish fed on plankton, algae, and other tiny organisms in the water. This balance created a thriving and stable ecosystem in the oceans, which supported a wide range of fish species. Fish were not only an important part of the ocean's ecosystems, but they also helped to drive the evolution of other marine life, including invertebrates and plants. Fish were not just important for the food web in the oceans, they also contributed to the development of other animals, particularly as some species began to move onto land. The lobe-finned fish, with their limb-like fins, were the first to venture from the water onto land. This marked a major milestone in the history of life on Earth, as it was the beginning of vertebrates adapting to terrestrial environments. These early fish were the ancestors of amphibians, and their descendants would eventually give rise to reptiles, birds, and mammals, including humans. While the fish of the Devonian were mainly confined to the seas, their evolution had far-reaching consequences. The development of more complex fish with jaws, bones, and limbs opened the door for the eventual spread of vertebrates across the land. As the first amphibians adapted to life on land, they brought with them the evolutionary traits that would later define all land-dwelling animals. The Age of Fishes was not only a time of great diversification in the oceans, but also the time when vertebrates began their transition to life on land. The explosion of fish species in the Devonian helped shape the world's oceans, and their evolution laid the foundation for future generations of animals. Fish were not only the dominant creatures of the seas, but also the ancestors of many of the animals that would eventually leave the oceans behind. The Age of Fishes was a time of rapid change and development, one that would influence the course of life on Earth for millions of years to come. As the Devonian period progressed, a dramatic shift took place in the world of life on Earth. The first vertebrates began to make the transition from the water to the land. These early vertebrates were amphibians, creatures that evolved from fish species. Their journey from the seas to dry land marked one of the most important steps in the history of life on Earth. The ancestors of these first land-dwelling vertebrates were fish, specifically lobe-finned fish. These fish, unlike the ray, finned fish, had thick, fleshy fins that resembled limbs. The structure of these fins was a key factor in the eventual evolution of land animals. Lobe-finned fish had muscles in their fins that allowed them to move in ways that were not possible for most fish. They could lift their fins and push themselves across the shallow waters or even along the seafloor. This ability to use their fins in a more limb-like fashion would be crucial for the transition to life on land. In the shallow waters of the Devonian, some of these lobe-finned fish began to move toward the land. The shallow seas that surrounded much of the continents were home to a variety of environments, some of which would have been challenging for fish. The water levels in some areas would have been low or fluctuating, leading fish to search for food in the mud and wetlands that lined the shore. These early vertebrates would have been exposed to air more frequently, and their growing ability to breathe oxygen through lungs, rather than gills, would have been a key factor in their ability to survive on land. The first amphibians were not fully land-dwelling creatures like mammals or reptiles. They were still closely tied to water, needing to return to it for reproduction. These amphibians were small, fish-like creatures with both aquatic and terrestrial features. They had sturdy, jointed limbs that allowed them to move along the wet, muddy land. Their lungs allowed them to breathe air, but they would still have needed to keep their skin moist to absorb oxygen and stay hydrated. The skin of these amphibians was smooth and permeable, which was useful for gas exchange, but also made them vulnerable to drying out. Despite these challenges, these early vertebrates found advantages on land. The first amphibians were predators that likely hunted small invertebrates and other creatures in the wetland environments they inhabited. Their limbs gave them an advantage when it came to moving on land. While they were not fast or efficient on land, their ability to explore new habitats helped them find food and avoid predators that lived in the water. This movement onto land also provided an opportunity to escape the crowded, competitive waters where food sources were limited. The development of limbs from the lobe-finned fish allowed these early amphibians to explore new areas beyond the shallow waters. These limbs were capable of supporting their bodies in the muddy, wet environments they inhabited, but they were not fully adapted for life on land. Over time, as these amphibians spent more time on land, they would have needed to further adapt to terrestrial conditions. The limbs would have become more robust, and their bodies would have become more suited to life outside the water. These changes would have made it possible for later amphibians to spend more time away from the water. Along with the evolution of limbs, the first amphibians also developed a more advanced respiratory system. The fish like ancestors of these animals, had gills to extract oxygen from the water. However, the amphibians that moved onto land had lungs that allowed them to breathe air. This adaptation was critical for their survival in a terrestrial environment. However, even with lungs, these amphibians still needed to keep their skin moist to help with oxygen exchange. Over time, as amphibians evolved, their lungs became more efficient, allowing them to live in a wider range of environments. The first vertebrates on land would have had to contend with the challenges of a dry and changing environment. The land was not as stable or predictable as the water. The temperature could fluctuate widely, and rain was not always guaranteed. The first amphibians were probably confined to areas near water, where they could easily return to the safety of the water to cool off and reproduce. They would have faced numerous threats, including predation by larger animals, and the lack of fully developed land ecosystems would have made survival difficult. However, over time the amphibians would have adapted more fully to life on land. They evolved better lungs, more efficient limbs, and greater tolerance to changes in temperature. These changes allowed them to move further from the water and take advantage of the opportunities that land offered. As amphibians adapted, new species began to emerge. Some amphibians continued to rely on water for reproduction, while others adapted to live in drier environments, eventually leading to the rise of reptiles. The transition of vertebrates from water to land had a lasting impact on the evolution of life on Earth. These early amphibians were the first creatures to occupy land and would go on to give rise to all land-dwelling vertebrates, including reptiles, birds, and mammals. The adaptations that allowed amphibians to live on land, such as lungs, limbs, and more efficient ways to move, would eventually give rise to the vast diversity of animals that we see on land today. In the Devonian, the first vertebrates were taking their first tentative steps onto land. Their ancestors had come from the oceans, and their bodies were still adapted to life in the water. However, these early amphibians demonstrated the flexibility of life to evolve and adapt to new environments. They showed how life on Earth was capable of taking on new challenges and finding new ways to survive and thrive. The story of the first vertebrates on land is one of innovation and transformation, marking a pivotal moment in the history of life on Earth. During the Devonian period, coral reefs began to rise and flourish, transforming the oceans into more complex ecosystems. Reef-building corals, which were still relatively simple compared to those found today, expanded rapidly and began to create large, intricate coral structures in the shallow seas that surrounded the continents. These reefs played an important role in shaping marine life during the Devonian and contributed to the increasing diversity of organisms that thrived in the oceans. Coral reefs start with tiny organisms called corals. These creatures live in colonies and build hard, protective skeletons made of calcium carbonate. The skeletons of these corals form the backbone of the reef, which grows larger over time as new generations of corals build on top of the old ones. The process of reef formation is slow but steady. As more corals grow and die, the reef becomes a towering structure, providing a home for many other species. During the Devonian, the conditions for coral reefs were ideal. The seas were warm and shallow, offering the perfect environment for corals to thrive. Corals need sunlight to grow, and the shallow seas allowed light to reach all parts of the reef. The waters were also rich in nutrients, which supported a wide variety of life forms. Reef-building corals, in particular, found these conditions favorable, and they began to expand, creating large, complex reefs. The corals of the Devonian were not the same as the corals we see today. While modern coral reefs are made up of hundreds of species of corals, the reefs of the Devonian were dominated by a few key groups. These early corals were mostly the rugose and tabulate corals, which had hard, stony skeletons that contributed to the structure of the reef. These corals were often organized into distinct patterns, with some species forming branching shapes, while others created massive, mound-like formations. The reefs they built were not as large or complex as today's coral reefs, but they were a significant step in the evolution of marine ecosystems. The growth of coral reefs in the Devonian was an important development because it provided a new type of habitat for marine life. The reefs offered shelter, food, and protection for a wide variety of organisms. Fish, mollusks, and arthropods all found homes in and around the reefs. The structure of the reef created many different niches, or small, specialized areas where different species could live and find food. For example, some fish lived among the coral branches, where they could hide from predators, while others fed on the tiny organisms that lived on the surface of the reef. As the reefs grew larger, they began to change the surrounding environment. The corals trapped sediments, which helped build up the reef structure and contributed to the formation of new habitats. The reefs also played a role in stabilizing the ocean floor, preventing erosion and providing a stable environment for other organisms to thrive. In a way, the reefs acted as both a physical barrier and an ecosystem, creating a safe and productive environment for marine life. The corals were not the only organisms involved in the development of the reefs. Other species of marine life helped to shape the structure of the reefs in their own way. For example, certain species of mollusks, such as clams and snails, attached themselves to the coral skeletons and contributed to the growth of the reef by secreting their own calcium carbonate shells. These animals helped to reinforce the coral structure, making the reef stronger and more stable. Similarly, other animals such as sponges also contributed to the development of the reef by filtering water and adding to the ecosystem. While coral reefs flourished during the Devonian, the world around them was not always stable. The Earth's climate and environment were constantly changing, and the reefs had to adapt to these fluctuations. For example, periods of cooling or changes in sea levels could affect the growth of corals. When sea levels rose, the corals could expand into new areas, building new reefs. When sea levels fell, the corals might have faced challenges, as they would have been exposed to air or less favorable conditions for growth. Despite these challenges, coral reefs continued to grow and evolve throughout the Devonian. They provided a stable foundation for many marine species and helped to support a growing diversity of life. The expansion of coral reefs during this period laid the groundwork for the more complex reef systems that would emerge in later periods. The ecosystems created by the coral reefs of the Devonian were not only important for marine life at the time, but also set the stage for the future evolution of marine ecosystems. The rise of coral reefs was also a key factor in the development of the first large complex marine ecosystems. As corals grew, they created a diverse and thriving environment that supported many different species. The fish and other marine life that inhabited the reefs had to adapt to the changing conditions, and their evolution played a role in shaping the structure of the reef ecosystem. The corals provided a foundation for other organisms, and in turn, the diverse marine life helped to shape the reef. Reef-building corals of the Devonian were crucial to the development of the world's oceans. As they expanded and formed large, complex reefs, they provided new habitats for a growing diversity of marine life. The coral reefs also contributed to the stability of the oceans, helping to prevent erosion and create new ecosystems. While these reefs were not as large or as complex as the coral reefs we see today, their rise during the Devonian marked a major step in the evolution of marine ecosystems. The reefs of the Devonian were the beginning of a long history of coral reefs that would continue to shape the oceans for millions of years. In the vast oceans of the Paleozoic era, marine invertebrates began to evolve in ways that marked some of the most significant changes in life on Earth. Trilobites, brachiopods, and mollusks played a key role in shaping marine ecosystems. These creatures, though very different from each other, share a common feature. They are invertebrates, meaning they lack a backbone. As the oceans grew more complex and diverse, these invertebrates adapted to fill various ecological roles, each making a unique contribution to the overall biodiversity of the seas. The trilobites were among the earliest invertebrates to appear in the fossil record. They evolved over 500 million years ago during the Cambrian period, a time when life on Earth was rapidly diversifying. Trilobites were arthropods related to modern insects and crustaceans. These creatures had segmented bodies, which allowed them to be highly mobile. Their exoskeletons, made of chitin, provided both protection and support. These features made trilobites highly adaptable, allowing them to thrive in a variety of marine environments, from shallow reefs to the deeper, darker waters of the ocean floor. Trilobites came in many shapes and sizes. Some were small and simple, while others grew to several feet in length. They were primarily scavengers, but many species were also capable of hunting smaller prey. The most distinctive feature of trilobites was their hard exoskeleton, which was divided into three major sections: the head, the thorax, and the tail. This body structure allowed trilobites to roll up into a ball when threatened, offering them protection from predators. As the trilobites flourished, brachiopods began to make their mark on the oceans. These marine animals looked somewhat like clams, but their shells were different in structure. Instead of being symmetrical like a bivalve's, the brachiopod shell was unequal, with the top and bottom halves differing in size and shape. Brachiopods were not as mobile as trilobites, but they had a unique feeding strategy that allowed them to thrive in the marine environment. Brachiopods had a specialized structure called a lophophore, which they used to filter tiny particles from the water. This lophophore acted like a fan, moving water across the animal's gills and trapping plankton and other small organisms. By feeding on plankton and detritus, brachiopods helped to clean the waters of their environments. Their stationary lifestyle made them a common sight on the ocean floor, where they anchored themselves to rocks or the seafloor, using a long stalk called a pedicle. Mollusks, another group of marine invertebrates, also played a significant role in the evolution of ocean ecosystems. Mollusks include a wide variety of animals, such as snails, clams, octopuses, and squids. The first mollusks evolved around 500 million years ago, and they soon became one of the most diverse groups in the ocean. Their soft bodies were often protected by a hard outer shell, which provided them with both physical protection and a means of mobility. Over time, mollusks developed various strategies for survival. Lone example is the evolution of the cephalopods, a group that includes squids, octopuses, and cuttlefish. Cephalopods are known for their remarkable intelligence and their ability to adapt to different environments. Unlike most mollusks, cephalopods have an internal skeleton which allows them to change shape and move more freely. Their well-developed eyes and complex nervous system gave them an advantage in hunting, and many species became highly effective predators. Squids, for instance, used jet propulsion to move quickly through the water, and octopuses are skilled at camouflage, blending in with their surroundings to avoid predators. While the cephalopods were becoming more advanced, other mollusks, such as clams and snails, adapted to different ways of life. Clams, for example, buried themselves in the sand or mud, where they were protected from predators. They used their siphons to filter food from the water, much like the brachiopods. Snails, on the other hand, evolved a spiral-shaped shell that provided extra protection. Some snails were herbivores, grazing on algae, while others were carnivores, hunting small animals or scavenging on dead organisms. In the oceans, these three groups of marine invertebrates, trilobites, brachiopods, and mollusks, help shape the way ecosystems functioned. Each had a role to play in the food web, whether it was as a predator, scavenger, or filter feeder. The diversity of these organisms created a dynamic and balanced environment where species interacted in complex ways. As they adapted to their surroundings, marine invertebrates also began to interact with other life forms, including early fish and other vertebrates, further contributing to the overall complexity of life on Earth. The evolution of marine invertebrates did not happen in isolation. Each new adaptation created opportunities for other species to thrive. For example, the hard exoskeleton of the trilobite provided a structure that other creatures could feed on, while the filter feeding brachiopods helped clean the water, creating an environment that supported even more species. As the oceans became more crowded with life, new forms of competition and cooperation emerged, pushing the evolution of marine invertebrates in different directions. Invertebrates also faced numerous challenges in their environments: predators, changing ocean conditions, and competition for food kept species on the move, constantly adapting to new pressures. Despite these challenges, the diversification of marine invertebrates during this time laid the foundation for the complexity of life in the oceans today. These creatures set the stage for the development of modern marine ecosystems, where diverse forms of life interact and depend on each other for survival. By studying the evolution of marine invertebrates, we gain a deeper understanding of how life on Earth has evolved over time. The fossil record of trilobites, brachiopods, and mollusks offers us a window into a past that was once dominated by these creatures. Their success in adapting to changing environments helped shape the course of evolution and created a rich tapestry of life that continues to thrive in the oceans today. During the Devonian period, a significant change took place in Earth's atmosphere that greatly affected the development of life. This change was the formation of the ozone layer. The ozone layer is a thin region of the Earth's stratosphere that absorbs most of the sun's harmful ultraviolet UV radiation. Prior to its formation, life on land faced constant threats from the sun's rays, which could cause damage to living organisms. The development of the ozone layer, which began to take shape during the Devonian period, allowed life to thrive on land by offering protection from these dangerous UV rays. Before the ozone layer formed, the atmosphere was much less capable of shielding the Earth from the sun's UV radiation. Ultraviolet radiation is known to be harmful because it can cause cellular damage. In the early stages of life, organisms on Earth lived primarily in the oceans, where the water acted as a natural barrier to UV rays. But as plants and animals began to evolve, life slowly started to move out of the oceans and onto land. However, the harsh UV radiation from the sun posed a serious challenge to this new land life. The formation of the ozone layer began with the rise of oxygen in the Earth's atmosphere. Oxygen is a byproduct of photosynthesis, a process carried out by plants and early algae. As more oxygen accumulated in the atmosphere, it started to react with the sun's rays, specifically ultraviolet light. This process led to the formation of ozone OFE, a molecule made up of 3 oxygen atoms. The ozone formed in the stratosphere, which is the second layer of Earth's atmosphere, starting about uni less above the surface. Ozone is highly effective at absorbing UV radiation, and its formation marked a major shift in the conditions on Earth. With the ozone layer in place, harmful ultraviolet radiation was significantly reduced before it reached the surface. This made the land safer for living organisms and allowed plants and animals to grow and evolve in new ways. The ozone layer acted like a shield, reducing the amount of radiation that could damage the genetic material of early life forms. Before the ozone layer's protection, life on land would have been exposed to more UV radiation, which could lead to mutations and other forms of damage. For example, UV radiation can cause DNA to break down, leading to errors in genetic replication. This could result in harmful mutations that would affect the growth and development of plants and animals. With the ozone layer in place, this danger was greatly reduced, making it easier for life to establish itself on land. The Devonian period was a time of major changes in the Earth's ecosystem. It marked the first appearance of many important plant and animal species on land. Plants began to spread across the landscape, forming the first forests, and early animals, including arthropods and vertebrates, began to move onto land as well. The protection provided by the ozone layer was essential for the survival of these early land-dwelling organisms. It allowed plants to grow taller and spread further, while animals could explore new environments without the constant threat of UV radiation damaging their cells. One of the most important developments in the Devonian period was the rise of the first true land plants. These plants were the first organisms to begin altering the land in a significant way. They helped shape the landscape by preventing erosion and creating the conditions for other forms of life to thrive. The ozone layer's protection allowed these plants to grow without being burned by the sun's rays. As plants began to spread across the land, they provided food and shelter for the animals that would follow. The rise of land animals also depended on the formation of the ozone layer. Early arthropods, such as millipedes and scorpions, were among the first animals to move onto land. These creatures faced a number of challenges, including the need to protect themselves from desiccation or drying out, and the need for a stable environment in which to reproduce. The ozone layer helped make the land more hospitable by reducing the amount of harmful UV radiation that could have caused damage to these early animals. The development of the ozone layer also had an impact on the evolution of vertebrates. During the Devonian period, the first amphibians appeared, evolving from fish that had adapted to life on land. These early amphibians still needed water to reproduce, but the protection of the ozone layer allowed them to venture further from the water and explore new environments. As vertebrates continued to evolve, the ozone layer provided a safer environment in which they could develop new traits and adapt to life on land. While the ozone layer began to form during the Devonian, its full development took millions of years. However, its presence had an immediate and lasting effect on the evolution of life on Earth. The reduction in UV radiation allowed ecosystems to flourish in ways that would not have been possible otherwise. Without the ozone layer, life on land would have been much more limited, and the development of complex ecosystems would have been much slower. Over time, the ozone layer has continued to play a crucial role in protecting life on Earth. It not only shields us from UV radiation, but also helps regulate the Earth's temperature by trapping heat in the atmosphere. Without the ozone layer, life on Earth would be exposed to higher levels of radiation, which could lead to an increase in health problems, such as skin cancer, and disrupt the balance of ecosystems. The formation of the ozone layer in the Devonian period marked a critical moment in Earth's history. It provided the protection that allowed life to thrive on land, setting the stage for the development of diverse ecosystems and the evolution of complex organisms. Without the ozone layer, life on land would have faced much greater challenges, and the course of evolution would have been very different. The development of the ozone layer was not just a significant step in the history of our planet, it was a key factor in the success of life on Earth. The appearance of the first true forests marked a major turning point in Earth's history. These forests didn't look like the forests we know today, but they played a critical role in shaping the planet's ecosystems. They were primarily made up of tall plants like Archaeopteris, a fern-like tree that thrived during the Devonian period. Archaeopteris was one of the first plants that grew tall enough to form the kind of tree, dense forests that would eventually support the complex ecosystems we see on Earth today. Before these forests, land was scattered with small, simple plants, such as mosses, liverworts, and ferns. These plants were typically low to the ground, and they didn't have the structure to support large animals or form complex ecosystems. While these early plants helped build the foundation for life on land, they weren't able to create the types of environments that could sustain more complex forms of life. The rise of trees, particularly Archaeopteris, changed that. Archaeopteris was unique in many ways. It was a tree-like plant that had characteristics of both ferns and conifers. Unlike modern trees, Archaeopteris didn't produce seeds. Instead, it reproduced through spores, much like ferns. Despite this, Archaeopteris had a strong, woody trunk that allowed it to grow taller than most of the plants around it. This ability to grow upward helped it compete for sunlight in the crowded forest spaces. Over time, Archaeopteris trees became the dominant species in the first true forests. These early forests were not just a collection of trees. They were a diverse mix of plants and other organisms that interacted with each other in complex ways. Archaeopteris, along with other plants, formed a canopy of leaves that shaded the ground below, creating different layers in the environment. This layering allowed for a variety of plants to thrive. Some plants grew in the shaded underbrush, while others reached toward the sunlight higher up in the canopy. This setup created multiple niches for different species, which, in turn, created new opportunities for animals to live on land. The development of the first forests also had a profound impact on the soil. The roots of trees like Archaeopteris helped anchor the soil and prevent erosion. As these trees died and decomposed, their remains added organic material to the soil, enriching it. This helped create a more fertile environment where plants could continue to grow and thrive. The presence of large plants also changed the way water moved through the land. Trees created a system of roots that allowed water to move through the soil more efficiently, helping to create a more stable environment for others. The shift from small plants to towering trees also had a significant impact on the atmosphere. As the first forests spread across the land, they began to absorb more carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. Trees, like Archaeopteris, carried out photosynthesis, a process that removes carbon dioxide from the air and releases oxygen. Over time, the spread of these plants contributed to the gradual increase in oxygen levels, which had a major influence on the development of life on Earth. The oxygen produced by the forests helped create an atmosphere that supported more complex forms of life, including animals. These forests also became the breeding grounds for many new species. The complex environments created by trees provided shelter for small animals. And as the forests continued to evolve, animals began to adapt to this new world. For example, insects that had previously lived in open environments began to thrive in the shade and protection of the forests. As these insects evolved, they became an important food source for other animals, helping to create the first food webs on land. The rise of forests also made it easier for animals to move between different areas of land. Prior to the forests, animals had to move across open landscapes with few places to hide or find food. The forests provided a much-needed refuge where animals could find both shelter and food. This allowed species to expand their territories and become more specialized in their behaviors and diets. Over time, these animals began to develop different strategies for survival, such as better camouflage and more efficient hunting skills. Archaeopteris, with its ability to grow tall and create an environment that supported diverse life, was a key player in the development of these ecosystems. The trees helped shape the world around them, from the soil to the atmosphere to the animals that lived in their shadows. They were among the first plants to provide the kind of structure that could support complex ecosystems, paving the way for the forests and diverse ecosystems we are familiar with today. While Archaeopteris was a dominant force in these early forests, it was not the only plant species to appear. Over time, other plants began to evolve and fill different ecological roles. Some plants grew even taller, while others adapted to life in the shade of the trees. The early forests were not static, but dynamic, with plants and animals constantly adapting to the changing conditions. As these forests continued to evolve, they became home to a wider variety of species. The first true forests of the Devonian period laid the groundwork for ecosystems that would grow more complex over millions of years. The development of these forests didn't just change the landscape, it changed the way life on Earth functioned. The plants, animals, and fungi of the forests formed intricate relationships that allowed the ecosystems to thrive. The first true forests were a world of competition, adaptation, and interaction. In this new environment, plants like Archaeopteris competed for sunlight, while animals adapted to the changing landscape. The forests didn't just provide shelter, they created opportunities for life to evolve in new and complex ways. The spread of these forests marked a shift from simple plant communities to rich, layered ecosystems that supported a wide range of life forms. In many ways, the first forests were the foundation of modern ecosystems. The interactions between plants, animals, and the environment set the stage for the development of more complex life forms. The appearance of tall trees like Archaeopteris was not just a physical change, it was a sign of a new way of life on Earth. These forests opened the door to the evolution of the world as we know it today. During a certain period in Earth's history, the climate was warm, with no polar ice caps. This created a world where sea levels were much higher than they are today. As a result, shallow seas covered large areas of the continents. The absence of ice caps meant that there was nothing to hold the water at the poles. Without the ice, the water flowed freely, raising the overall sea level and flooding the land. Imagine a time when much of the land we now know as dry was actually underwater. Coastal regions were vast, and areas that we now see as mountains or flat plains were once submerged beneath these warm, shallow seas. These seas were not deep, but they stretched across entire continents, turning areas that are now deserts or forests into swamps or tropical seas. Take the example of the Western Interior Seaway in North America, which cut the continent in two during the Cretaceous period. This sea was a large body of water that spanned from the Gulf of Mexico to the Arctic Ocean. It was shallow, with water depths that were only a few hundred meters deep in many places. The warm climate caused the water to evaporate less than it does now, so there was always a steady supply of water feeding into the seaway. As a result, it became a rich ecosystem, full of marine life, and an essential part of the environment at the time. The land surrounding these seas was lush and full of life. There were forests in what are now arid regions, and the climate supported a wide variety of plants and animals. For instance, areas of modern-day North America that are dry today were once home to dense tropical forests. In places like this, the warmth and abundant water created conditions where plants could thrive. Giant ferns, towering trees, and other prehistoric plants grew in the humid, warm climate. These plants formed the base of a food chain that supported large reptiles, including dinosaurs. Because the seas were shallow, the coastlines of these seas were dynamic. The water often covered and uncovered vast stretches of land due to tides, storms, and the slow movement of the Earth's crust. Coastal ecosystems like mangroves, estuaries, and wetlands flourished, offering a rich environment for both marine and terrestrial life. In the shallows, coral reefs developed, and they became homes for a variety of species. These reefs were not as large or as well developed as modern ones, but they still supported a diverse range of life, from small fish to larger predators. Meanwhile, the warm climate had a significant impact on life far from the coasts. In the interior regions of the continents, temperatures stayed high, but the absence of ice caps meant there was less extreme seasonal variation, The lack of polar ice meant that cold, dry winds from the poles did not make their way to the equator. As a result, areas that are now frozen tundras or icy regions were once temperate or even tropical. In these areas, animals adapted to the warmth, with some growing larger than their modern-day descendants. For instance, giant insects roamed the forests, benefiting from the increased levels of oxygen in the air, which were higher than they are today. The warm climate also led to more stable weather patterns. There were fewer drastic temperature swings, and the overall climate allowed for more consistent growing seasons. This meant that plants and animals had time to grow and reproduce in a more predictable environment. For example, fruit, bearing trees and other plants that needed long growing seasons were able to thrive. Similarly, herbivores had a steady food supply, which in turn supported large predators. However, this warm climate was not without its challenges. The high sea levels meant that many areas that we now see as land were permanently covered by water. This left animals and plants with less space to spread out. As a result, competition for space and resources was fierce. It also meant that ecosystems were smaller and more isolated, with species developing unique traits to survive in these enclosed environments. This lack of land also affected the movement of species. Animals that lived on the land had fewer places to migrate, and many species became confined to specific regions. For example, dinosaurs and other reptiles often adapted to live in the warm, wet conditions found in the coastal regions. The lack of large ice sheets also meant there were fewer natural barriers to the movement of species, but the presence of the warm seas still limited where certain species could go. The high sea levels also had a direct impact on the geography of the land. With more water on the planet, the coastlines were much more extensive. Large parts of the continents were submerged, while areas that are now underwater were once land. For example, the shallow seas of the Tethys Ocean covered much of the land that we now see as Europe and Asia. These seas were rich in marine life, but the land surrounding them had a more tropical environment. In addition to these warm seas, the land was also subject to the effects of volcanic activity. Volcanoes played a role in the climate by releasing gases like carbon dioxide, which further contributed to the greenhouse effect. As volcanic activity increased, it added more heat to the Earth's atmosphere, making the climate even warmer. This created a feedback loop where the more heat trapped in the atmosphere, the warmer the seas became and the higher the sea levels rose. The absence of polar ice caps had a profound effect on the atmosphere as well. Without the large ice masses, there were fewer reflective surfaces to bounce the Sunday's energy back into space. The result was an increase in the amount of solar energy absorbed by the Earth, warming the oceans and the air. This shift in energy distribution also led to changes in atmospheric circulation, affecting wind patterns and rainfall distribution. For example, without ice to cool the poles, the trade winds and other wind patterns were much stronger. This meant that tropical regions often received more rain, while areas in the mid-latitudes were drier. This contributed to the creation of deserts in areas that are now dry, such as parts of Africa and Asia. These shifts in climate and geography created a world vastly different from the one we know today. The high sea levels and warm temperatures allowed for a variety of life forms to flourish in regions where they would not be able to survive in the present. In these conditions, ecosystems were rich and diverse, even if they were often isolated from one another. While the world was warmer and the seas were higher, life found ways to adapt, creating a world that was both strange and familiar in its own way. During a time long ago, warm, shallow seas covered much of the land. These seas were full of life, especially near the equator where the climate was hottest. The water was shallow, only a few hundred meters deep in many areas. This meant that sunlight could easily reach the ocean floor, encouraging the growth of plants and the creatures that lived off them. The shallow seas were a perfect environment for life to thrive. The warm waters provided a steady supply of food, while the sunlight made it possible for plants to grow. These plants were crucial for the animals that lived in the seas, as they formed the base of the food chain. Similar to how a forest is full of life today, the shallow seas were teeming with plants, small creatures, and larger animals that fed on them. One of the most important groups of life in these seas were the plankton. These tiny organisms were everywhere in the water, drifting along with the currents. Plankton served as food for a wide range of creatures, from the smallest fish to the largest marine reptiles. Much like how insects are vital in modern ecosystems, plankton played a key role in the balance of life in the shallow seas. Fish, many of which were similar to modern species, flourished in these seas. They lived in large schools, moving together through the warm waters. These schools of fish were important for maintaining the health of the ecosystem. They fed on plankton, smaller creatures, helping control their populations. Larger fish, such as predatory species, hunted the smaller fish, keeping their numbers in check. This created a balanced environment where each species had a role to play. In the warm, shallow waters, coral reefs were common. These reefs provided homes for many marine creatures. Corals, tiny animals that lived together in large colonies, built massive structures that supported a rich variety of life. These reefs were not as complex as the ones we see today, but they still played an important role in the ecosystem. Many species of fish, crustaceans, and other animals used the reefs as shelter or as places to find food. The reefs also helped to stabilize the surrounding waters by breaking the waves and reducing the strength of currents. Larger creatures, like marine reptiles, also thrived in these seas. Creatures like the mosasaurus and ichthyosaurs, which lived during the Cretaceous period, ruled the seas. These animals were the top predators in the warm, shallow waters. The mosasaurus, for example, was a giant marine reptile that grew to lengths of over 30 feet. It hunted fish, squid, and even other marine reptiles. These large predators helped to keep the population of smaller animals in check, maintaining the balance in the ecosystem. Alongside these predators were the herbivores, like large turtles and other marine reptiles that fed on the plants and algae. These creatures helped to keep the plant life in the shallow seas healthy by eating the algae and smaller plants that grew in the water. Their presence allowed for a diversity of plant species to grow, creating a more varied and healthy ecosystem. The warm climate also supported an array of smaller creatures that made their home in the shallow seas. Crustaceans such as crabs and shrimp scuttled along the seafloor, feeding on detritus and smaller animals. Mollusks like clams and oysters buried themselves in the sand, filtering the water for food. These creatures were vital in recycling nutrients in the ecosystem, breaking down organic matter and keeping the water clean. The shallow seas near the equator were especially rich in life. The constant warmth and abundant food sources created ideal conditions for marine life. These seas were filled with life in every layer of the water column. The surface was teeming with fish and plankton, while the seafloor was home to corals, mollusks, and other creatures. The middle layers of the water were filled with larger fish and marine reptiles hunting for food. The ecosystems in these shallow seas were complex. Species depended on each other for food and survival. The fish needed the plankton, while the larger predators fed on the fish. The corals depended on the plankton for food and the healthy balance of marine life. In turn, the predators helped control the populations of smaller creatures, keeping the ecosystem from becoming unbalanced. These shallow seas were not only a place for marine creatures to live, they also helped shape the land around them. The seas covered large areas of the continents, creating coastlines that were rich in life. As the seas rose and fell, they shaped the land, leaving behind fossils and traces of the creatures that once lived there. The warm, shallow seas were also home to many species that have since gone extinct. While some creatures, like fish and turtles, continue to live in the seas today, others, such as the marine reptiles, are long gone. These ancient seas were a world full of strange and amazing creatures that no longer exist. Yet, their legacy lives on in the ecosystems that still thrive in the oceans today. The warm, shallow seas provided a unique environment where life could flourish. The combination of warmth, sunlight, and food created conditions that supported a diverse range of creatures, from the smallest plankton to the largest marine reptiles. These seas were a vital part of the Earth's history, shaping the world as we know it today. They were a place of constant change, where the tides, the weather, and the creatures living in the water all played a role in creating a thriving ecosystem. Even though these seas are no longer present, the creatures that lived there left their mark, and their story continues to be told through the fossils and memories of a world long gone. At the end of the Devonian period, Earth went through a significant shift. This time, a massive extinction event wiped out many marine species, changing the face of life in the oceans. While scientists are still piecing together the exact causes, there are several factors that likely contributed. Climate change, sea level changes, and asteroid impacts seem to have combined in a way that left the oceans empty of many species. The climate during the late Devonian was already going through shifts. The planet was warmer than it had been in earlier periods, and there were large fluctuations in temperature. As the climate changed, it caused disruptions in the ecosystems that had developed over millions of years. Some species could not adapt to the sudden changes in temperature and oxygen levels in the water. For instance, creatures that lived in colder waters or depended on stable temperatures for survival found it harder to live as conditions became unstable. One of the main factors was the fluctuation in sea levels. During this time, the sea levels rose and fell dramatically. These changes were tied to the shifting of tectonic plates and possibly even to changes in the Earth's climate. As the seas rose, they flooded land areas, creating new coastlines and shallow seas. However, when the sea levels dropped, many of these habitats were lost. The shallow seas, which had been rich in marine life, became dry or were replaced with deep, uninhabitable waters. This dramatic loss of habitat was a huge blow to the species that lived in these regions. The loss of shallow seas would have been particularly tough on species that depended on those environments. Shallow seas were home to many types of fish, corals, and other marine life. When the sea levels fell, these species lost their homes, and without the shallow water they needed, they were unable to survive. The loss of coastal and shallow environments meant that the creatures that once thrived in them had no place to go. Another factor that contributed to the extinction event was the impact of asteroid or comet strikes. While the evidence for asteroid impacts is still debated, scientists think that some of the extinctions may have been triggered by such impacts. These large space rocks could have hit Earth, causing massive damage to the environment. An asteroid impact would have sent large amounts of dust and debris into the atmosphere, blocking out the sunday and cooling the planet. This sudden drop in temperature would have disrupted the delicate balance of life in the oceans, making it difficult for many species to survive. In addition to causing a cooling effect, the asteroid impacts could have caused massive waves and disturbances in the water. These waves would have spread across the oceans, destroying habitats and directly killing marine life. The impact could have also released toxic gases into the atmosphere, further complicating the survival of many species. This mix of cooling destruction of habitats and poisoning of the atmosphere would have created an environment where it was nearly impossible for marine species to thrive. The combination of these factors, climate change, sea level fluctuations, and asteroid impacts, created an unstable environment. The oceans, which had once been rich in life, became hostile to many species. In addition to the changes in temperature and habitat, the decrease in oxygen levels in the water played a significant role. The oceans were no longer able to hold as much oxygen as they once did, and many species that relied on oxygen-rich waters to survive could no longer breathe. As a result, the extinction event led to the loss of both marine plants and animals. The species most affected were the ones that lived in the shallow seas. These seas were rich in life, but they were also the first to be impacted by changes in sea level. As the sea levels dropped, these habitats disappeared. Creatures that lived on the ocean floor, such as corals, mollusks, and certain fish species, struggled to survive. The loss of these species meant that entire ecosystems collapsed. When the base of the food chain was gone, the larger creatures that depended on them for food also began to die off. Fish, which had been diversifying and spreading across the oceans during the Devonian, also faced massive challenges. The loss of shallow seas meant that many of the fish that lived there could not survive. The decrease in oxygen levels further harmed fish species. Some species were able to adapt, but many others could not. This led to a sharp decline in marine life across the planet. One of the most noticeable groups to suffer was the placoderm fish. These armored fish had been dominant in the oceans during the Devonian, but by the end of the period, many species had vanished. It is likely that these fish were unable to adapt to the changing conditions. As the climate shifted and habitats disappeared, they faced a decline in numbers that they could not recover from. The extinction event also had a major impact on the reefs. Coral reefs, which were abundant in the Devonian seas, were hit hard. As sea levels fluctuated and temperatures changed, the corals struggled to survive. Corals are sensitive to changes in temperature, and they rely on stable conditions to grow. The combination of fluctuating temperatures and the loss of shallow seas made it difficult for the coral reefs to survive. As the reefs died off, many species that depended on them, such as small fish and invertebrates, also perished. The final result of the extinction event was a significant decrease in marine biodiversity. The oceans, which had once been filled with a wide range of species, became emptier. Many of the creatures that had once thrived in the shallow seas were gone. Some species survived, but the ecosystem was forever changed. The creatures that survived were those that were able to adapt to the changing conditions, but they were far fewer in number. In many cases, it took millions of years for life in the oceans to fully recover. The Devonian extinction event was one of the many mass extinctions Earth has experienced. While it was not as famous as the extinction event that wiped out the dinosaurs, it had a lasting impact on the marine life of the time. The causes of this event, climate change, sea level fluctuations, and asteroid impacts, created an environment that was difficult for many species to survive in. This extinction marked the end of an era in the oceans and paved the way for new species to emerge. The aftermath of the event left the oceans different from before, and life would never be the same again. During a time long ago, the Earth saw a shift in its environment. Plants began to spread and cover the land in new ways, but large land animals were still missing. Instead, the first creatures that ventured onto land were small and amphibian. Like these early vertebrates were not the towering beasts we think of today, but rather small, simple creatures that lived part of their lives in the water and part on land. At this point, the land was still a very different place compared to what we know now. It was not covered in lush forests and vast grasslands like today's Earth. The first plants were small and simple, and large trees had not yet appeared. The land was often barren or covered with thick mats of moss and ferns, creating a world where only the hardiest of life could survive. The conditions were not easy, and the early land animals had to be well suited to handle the harsh changing environment. The first land vertebrates were amphibians, creatures that spent much of their time in the water. These animals had evolved from fish, and they were still very much tied to the water. They had lungs to breathe air, but their skin needed to stay moist, and they had to return to the water to reproduce. These creatures were small, with most being no larger than a few feet long. They looked more like modern amphibians, such as frogs, than the large reptiles we might imagine today. One of the earliest of these land-dwelling vertebrates was Acanthostega, a creature that had both fish-like and amphibian-like traits. It had limbs instead of fins, which allowed it to crawl along the shorelines. But it was still largely aquatic. It had gills and lungs, suggesting it lived both in water and on land. Acanthostega and other similar species were not built to roam vast stretches of land. Instead, they stayed near the water, where they could keep their skin moist, and where the environment was more familiar. These early vertebrates were not yet ready to venture far from the water. Unlike modern amphibians, which can move easily between land and water, these early creatures were confined to the edges of lakes, rivers, and ponds. They were still learning how to survive on land, and the land was not yet fully ready to support large animals. While plants were beginning to spread, the air was not rich with oxygen like it is today, and the land lacked the kind of stable, supportive ecosystems that would later allow for the rise of larger animals. As the plants began to spread, they provided more food and shelter for small animals. The evolution of land plants was one of the key factors that made the eventual rise of larger animals possible. Early land plants like mosses and ferns helped to form a more stable environment. But they did not provide the same support or food sources that the vast forests and grasses of later periods would offer. These plants were low to the ground, and they often grew in clumps or mats. This limited the kinds of animals that could survive and grow in such an environment. Without large animals, the land was quiet. There were no herds of large mammals or towering dinosaurs wandering the earth. Instead, the land was populated by small, often primitive creatures. The amphibians, small in size and limited in range, were the most notable of these creatures. They did not roam across vast stretches of land, but instead made use of small patches of terrain, staying close to the water to ensure survival. The lack of large terrestrial animals also meant that there were no predators large enough to challenge these small amphibians. The land was not yet home to the giant reptiles or mammals that would later dominate. However, this also meant that the ecosystem was simpler. While small amphibians might have faced challenges from larger predatory fish or invertebrates in the water, on land they were the dominant creatures. The environment was not yet full of complex food chains or large predators. The ecosystem was still in its infancy. As the world changed, more plants began to colonize the land. They spread out, covering more area and forming thicker layers of vegetation. These plants helped to stabilize the soil, creating more habitable spaces for animals. But still, the animals that lived there were small and not yet adapted to the challenges of large-scale terrestrial life. For example, early amphibians had to deal with the threat of drying out, as their skin needed to stay moist. The lack of a fully developed atmosphere and climate conditions made it harder for animals to grow large or venture far from water sources. The land was still in transition. The first vertebrates on land had to navigate a world that was very different from the oceans or the lakes, where they had evolved. Without the large animals that would later reshape the environment, the land was quieter, with fewer animals moving across it. The plants were still small, and large trees had not yet developed. It was a world of small creatures, where amphibians dominated but did not yet rule. They were still figuring out how to live on land. This period also marked a time of experimentation in evolution. The early amphibians were experimenting with life outside the water. Their bodies were still adapted for life in the water, and many species were more comfortable in the shallows than on dry land. These early amphibians would eventually give rise to reptiles, which could better adapt to life on land. But at this point in Earth's history, the large land-dwelling reptiles that would follow had not yet evolved. The evolutionary paths were still forming, while these small amphibians were the first land vertebrates. They were not the only animals to make the jump from water to land. Over time, other groups of animals, such as the ancestors of reptiles, began to make their way onto land as well. However, these animals were still small and amphibian-like, and they had to rely on the water to survive. The transition from life in the water to life on land was slow and fraught with challenges. The first vertebrates that walked on land were still not fully adapted to terrestrial life, and it would take millions of years for larger animals to emerge. During this time, the world was still dominated by aquatic life. The oceans were full of fish and other marine creatures, and many ecosystems were thriving in the waters. On land, however, life was in its early stages. The first land vertebrates were small, amphibian-like creatures that lived in the transition zone between land and water. They were not yet the large, powerful animals that would later walk the earth. Instead, they were just beginning to explore the possibilities of life on solid ground. During a key period in Earth's history, fish underwent major changes, leading to new forms and features that would play an important role in the future of life on land. Among these fish were the placoderms, armored creatures that marked a major shift in the evolution of fish. Alongside them, lobed, finned fish began to evolve, creatures that would eventually give rise to the ancestors of amphibians. These changes in fish were some of the earliest steps in the long process that eventually led to vertebrates living on land. The placoderms were some of the first fish to appear with true armor. These armored fish were covered in thick plates of bone, giving them protection from predators. The name placoderm itself comes from the Greek words meaning plate and skin. These fish lived in the oceans and were among the first vertebrates to have a hard outer covering. This feature provided them with an advantage in the dangerous waters of their time. With their bodies shielded by armor, placoderms were better able to survive attacks from larger, more powerful predators. Placoderms were diverse in their forms. Some species were relatively small, while others grew to large sizes, reaching up to 30 feet long. Their armor not only protected them, but it also played a role in how they moved. With the tough exterior, these fish had to rely on different ways of swimming compared to fish that lacked such protection. They were among the most dominant creatures in their ecosystems, able to move efficiently in the water while being safe from many types of attackers. Alongside the placoderms, another group of fish began to emerge, the lobed finned fish. These fish had fins that were more fleshy and supported by a central bone structure, unlike the more typical fin structures of other fish. The lobed fins were an important step in the evolution of vertebrates, as they set the stage for the development of legs. This change in their anatomy was crucial for the eventual transition from aquatic life to life on land. Lobed, finned fish, like coelacanths and dipnoi lungfish, lived in the water, but had features that would later be key to life outside it. Their fins were structured like the limbs of land animals, a feature that would allow these fish to move across land when the time came. This connection between their fins and the limbs of land vertebrates means that lobed, finned fish are seen as the ancestors of amphibians. These fish were capable of short, limited movements in shallow waters, using their lobed fins to push against the ground and swim or move along the bottom. The early development of lobed fins was a slow but significant change. These fins allowed the fish to have more control over their movement, making it easier to maneuver in shallower waters and in areas with less flow. For these early fish, the ability to use their fins for more than just swimming was an important step toward greater mobility, and eventually the move onto land. One of the most important features of lobed, finned fish was their ability to breathe air. Unlike most fish, which rely on gills to extract oxygen from water, lobed finned fish could gulp air at the surface. This ability helped them survive in environments with low oxygen levels, such as stagnant ponds or shallow pools. This adaptation was key for their future evolution. As the environment continued to change, fish that could take in air as well as extract oxygen from the water had an advantage over those that could not. The evolution of the lobed fin was part of a broader pattern in the development of vertebrates. Fish were moving from living solely in the water to using land for parts of their lives. As the landscape changed, fish that could handle life on land began to emerge. The lobed fins, along with the ability to breathe air, were early signs of the capabilities these creatures would need to survive outside of water. Some species of lobed, finned fish began to venture into areas of land that were flooded or shallow enough to make the move. They used their strong lobed fins to push through the muddy bottom of shallow waters, moving short distances on land. These movements were awkward and limited at first, but over millions of years they paved the way for more advanced creatures that would walk on land. It's important to note that while these fish were not fully land-dwelling, their features allowed them to take advantage of the changing environments. Shallow, warm waters were becoming more common, and as they did, there were more opportunities for fish with unique features like lobed fins and air-breathing capabilities to thrive. These early adaptations were the first steps toward life on land, which would eventually lead to the development of the first amphibians. At the same time, placoderms continued to thrive in the oceans. While their armor provided them with protection, it also meant that their evolution was more limited. The placoderms' armor was heavy, and as the oceans changed, these fish struggled to adapt as quickly as their more flexible cousins, the lobed, finned fish. Over time, the placoderms became less dominant, and many species went extinct. The changes in fish during this period were crucial to the development of all land vertebrates. As lobed, finned fish continued to evolve, some species began to lose their reliance on water entirely. They spent more time on land and began to evolve into the amphibians we recognize today. These amphibians would be the first vertebrates to make the transition from water to land. The evolution of fish during this time set the stage for the vast variety of animals that would later populate the earth. The placoderms and lobed, finned fish were early steps in a long process of adaptation and survival. The key to their success was their ability to evolve new features like armor and specialized fins that allowed them to thrive in an ever-changing world. The evolution of fish was not just about surviving in the oceans. It was about preparing for a future where life would move beyond the water and onto land. As these changes occurred, the oceans and rivers were full of different types of fish, each with its own strategies for survival. Some fish, like the placoderms, relied on tough armor to protect themselves, while others, like the lobed finned fish, developed more flexible bodies and new abilities, allowing them to eventually take their first steps on land. The story of fish evolution is the story of adaptability, where small changes led to some of the biggest shifts in life on Earth. During a time in Earth's history, volcanic activity was intense and widespread, shaping the environment in significant ways. The eruptions released large amounts of gases and ash into the atmosphere, which had far-reaching effects on the climate. One of the key gases released during these eruptions was carbon dioxide, or a greenhouse gas that traps heat in the atmosphere. As volcanic activity increased, it likely caused a rise in CO levels, which contributed to warming the planet. The eruptions weren't limited to just a few areas. They were happening all around the globe. Massive volcanic eruptions were frequent, especially along tectonic plate boundaries, where the Earth's crust was cracking and shifting. These volcanic events sent ash and gases high into the atmosphere, where they had a direct impact on the climate. Some of the gases, like sulfur dioxide, reflected sunlight and temporarily cooled the Earth's surface. But over time, the larger buildup of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere led to a long-term warming effect. One of the main ways volcanic activity influenced the climate was through the release of CO. Carbon dioxide, a key greenhouse gas, is very effective at trapping heat from the sun. As the levels of CO rose, it created a warming effect that changed the Earth's climate. This warming would have affected both the oceans and the atmosphere. In particular, higher temperatures likely led to changes in weather patterns and shifts in ecosystems. Imagine a scenario where the atmosphere becomes gradually thicker with CO over thousands of years. The increased carbon dioxide traps more heat, causing global temperatures to rise. This warming could have led to a number of changes. For example, the polar regions might have experienced less ice buildup, leading to higher sea levels as more water flowed into the oceans. Warmer temperatures could also have altered rainfall patterns, making some regions wetter, while others became drier. These changes in climate were not just limited to temperature shifts. The volcanic eruptions also contributed to the growth of new landforms. As lava spread and cooled, it formed new rock formations and altered landscapes. Over time, these volcanic lands became home to new ecosystems. However, these eruptions also had more immediate effects. The ash and gases from volcanoes could darken the skies, blocking sunlight and causing temporary cooling effects in certain areas. This combination of warming from CO and cooling from ash created an unstable climate, with shifts in both temperature and weather patterns. The volcanic activity also impacted the composition of the atmosphere in other ways. Volcanic eruptions release sulfur dioxide, which reacts with water in the atmosphere to form sulfuric acid. This acid can create aerosols that reflect sunlight, leading to temporary cooling. However, this cooling effect would have been short-lived compared to the long-term warming caused by the rising CO levels. These changes in the atmosphere likely led to shifts in ecosystems, affecting both plant and animal life. For instance, higher CO levels would have affected plant life, as plants rely on carbon dioxide for photosynthesis. In some cases, plants may have thrived with more CO, as the increased carbon in the atmosphere could have provided them with more resources. However, rapid shifts in climate and changes in temperature could have made it difficult for some plants to survive. Species that were adapted to cooler or more stable climates may have struggled to adjust to the changing conditions, leading to shifts in plant populations. As for animal life, the warming climate and shifts in ecosystems likely impacted them as well. In the oceans, warmer temperatures could have affected marine species, especially those that relied on colder waters. Many species may have been forced to move to cooler areas or adapt to the new temperatures. On land, plants and animals may have had to adjust to changing rainfall patterns. In some regions, plants may have flourished due to increased CO and warmer temperatures, while in others, the changes could have led to the decline of species that couldn't adapt quickly enough. Volcanic activity also had an impact on the oceans. As volcanic eruptions released gases and ash, these materials could have reached the oceans, affecting their chemistry and temperature. The CO, released by volcanoes, would have dissolved into the oceans, increasing the acidity of the water. This process, known as ocean acidification, could have had a negative impact on marine life, particularly organisms with calcium carbonate shells or skeletons, such as corals and shellfish. Over time, the constant volcanic activity would have led to a shift in the overall composition of the atmosphere. The increase in CO likely created a more greenhouse-gas-driven environment, where the Earth retained more heat. This change would have lasted for long periods, possibly millions of years. It wasn't just a temporary warming effect, caused by a single volcanic eruption, but rather a longer-term trend of increasing volcanic activity that built up CO levels in the atmosphere. This buildup of CO and other gases would have triggered a number of feedback loops that further intensified the warming process. For instance, warmer temperatures could have caused ice sheets to melt, which would have released more CO and methane into the atmosphere. This, in turn, would have led to even more warming. Additionally, The release of gases like methane from volcanic activity could have added to the greenhouse effect, further warming the planet. These changes in the atmosphere and climate had wide gen-reaching effects as the temperature rose and the atmosphere thickened with sea, or the planet became a more hostile place for many species that couldn't adapt quickly enough. In some areas, ecosystems might have shifted rapidly, with new species emerging while others went extinct. In the oceans, species that could tolerate warmer water or higher acidity would have survived, while others may have struggled to keep up with the changes. This period of intense volcanic activity and climate change set the stage for many evolutionary changes. The warming climate and altered atmospheric conditions could have driven species to adapt in new ways. Some species may have developed the ability to cope with higher temperatures or changes in food sources. Others may have migrated to different areas where the climate was more favorable. The volcanic activity played a crucial role in shaping the Earth's climate, altering the environment in ways that affected all life on the planet. The volcanic activity and resulting climate changes during this period were more than just an environmental shift. They triggered a series of events that led to the evolution of new species and ecosystems. While volcanic eruptions caused short gen-term disruptions, their long gen-term effects, particularly the increase in atmospheric carbon dioxide, played a key role in shaping life on Earth. The warming planet, combined with changing environments, created new challenges and opportunities for the species living at the time, setting the stage for the evolution of future life forms.